Tonight, my friends, I want to tell you a story whispered through stone walls and cloisters, where silence was not only respected, it was demanded. A story that never made its way into history books, but lived in glances, in footsteps, and in doors that creaked closed with heavy iron locks. In the Middle Ages, chastity wasn't a choice for many women. It was a condition, a rule, a currency of value in places where love rarely walked freely. While kings ruled with swords and bishops with scrolls, young girls were ruled by silence, and the price of their purity was not just spiritual, but social, physical, and often deeply personal. Imagine a small village tucked between forest and field. No loud markets, just thatched roofs, the scent of bread baked on stones, and distant bells ringing from a hilltop monastery. In this village lived girls whose futures were not their own futures, arranged in whispers over supper, in contracts signed by fathers and priests, in cold decisions made behind tapestries. For them, chastity was not a virtue they chose, but a boundary drawn by others, and every girl knew. One stain on her name, even imagined, could turn her from daughter to disgrace. The story I'll share with you tonight follows one such girl. Not a queen, not a martyr, just a girl with a quiet voice and eyes that carried questions she was never allowed to ask aloud. Her name was Elira. She lived in a house with low windows and a garden where she was taught to walk quietly, sit straight, and never speak unless spoken to. Her hair was always braided, her letters burned after reading. But inside her, a flame stayed lit not of rebellion, but of wonder. Why did her body belong to everyone else? Why did her silence seem more valuable than her dreams? And what would happen if that silence broke? Elira had just turned 15 when the whispers began. Not in the streets, but inside her own home between her mother and a visiting man with rings on each finger and a face carved from certainty. He smelled of ink and old books, not because he read them, but because he signed them. His name was Lord Taven, and he owned the land that touched the edge of their village. He wasn't cruel, nor kind, he simply believed the world should move the way he told it to. And on that day, his eyes fell on Elira. She was pouring water into a wooden basin when she felt the pause in the room. The boy's silence stretched like wax near flame. Her mother's voice was steady, too steady. That's when she knew a decision had already been made, and she had not been part of it in those days. Arrangements weren't questions, they were obligations, wrapped in lace and sealed with wax. If a girl's family was poor, a match to a man like Lord Taven could mean survival for them all. A roof that didn't leak, bread without worry. But what it meant for the girl, that was the part no one ever said out loud. Elira was to be tested, of course. A young woman of her age and station had to prove she had been untouched. The ritual wasn't whispered, it was planned, detailed, agreed upon. A midwife would visit. A cloth would be inspected. The bed would be observed. And Elira, she would not speak. Her brother tried to ask questions, but was silenced with a look. Her father said nothing, only sharpened tools in the yard, as if the wood might offer him some kind of answer. That night, Elira lay awake listening to the quiet creaks of the house, wondering if anyone else felt the weight of what was coming. Not a wedding, not a celebration, but a performance, one in which her body would be the stage, and her silence the only thing allowed to speak. The days that followed moved slowly, like winter light through stained glass, quiet, cold, and filled with colors that no one dared to name. Elira's mother stitched white linen at the table, her fingers moving fast, as if each thread could sow certainty into a future neither of them truly understood. Every movement in the house became part of a larger ritual. The linens were bleached and folded, rosewater was warmed and left by the window, and the midwife, a severe woman named Ilda, began her visit not with smiles, but with glances sharp enough to cut. She asked no questions, only gave instructions. Eat this, don't speak, rest early. Elira nodded, though her body felt like it was no longer hers. Every room she entered now watched her. Every object felt like a witness. The villagers knew, of course, not with their words, but with the way they stepped aside when she passed, or the way their eyes lowered just a moment too long. In small places like hers, nothing stayed secret. Girls had vanished before, some taken to monasteries, others to estates. But those who stayed and failed the test were never truly seen again. Elira remembered one girl, years ago, who had cried during her own ritual. They said she had trembled too much, and when no blood appeared on the cloth, the wedding vanished. And so did she. The cloth, after all, spoke louder than any girl ever could on the eve of the inspection. The sky hung low and grey, Elira stood in the garden her mother once planted with thyme and sage, her foot in the damp earth, and looked toward the hills. She thought of running not far, just away. But where would she go? Every road was owned, every church, every barn, every stone underfoot was part of someone's claim. That night, as she washed her hands in silence, she saw her reflection in a copper basin, still, pale and unfamiliar. And deep in her chest, where dreams once lived, a single thought echoed. What is purity, if it must be proven like a crime? Morning arrived like it didn't want to. The sky was heavy, and the birds were quiet. Elira rose before anyone else, her bare feet finding the chill of the floor, the wooden boards creaking softly beneath her steps. She moved without sound, as if trying to delay the hours by walking slowly. Her mother had already laid out the white gown, simple, long-sleeved, and spotless. Beside it sat the linen cloth, folded in half, wrapped with a thin ribbon the color of bone. It wasn't just fabric, it was a witness, and Elira would soon be judged by what it carried or didn't. She touched it gently, the way one touches something sacred or dangerous. There was no ceremony, no soft voice to explain what would happen. There never was. In the village, girls were expected to know. The silence was the lesson. Ilda arrived with a basket and a look that did not ask permission. She examined Elira with clinical distance, her hands cold, her voice even colder. You'll lie down after supper. You'll not eat anything too heavy. Drink only the mint water. That was all. Elira didn't respond, not because she agreed, but because she didn't know how to ask questions anymore. The walls of her home, once filled with the smell of bread and the hum of her father's songs, now felt like the inside of a locked chest. Everything was being prepared not for her comfort, but for the ritual. The test, everyone said, was to protect her honor. But no one ever asked how it felt to carry that weight. Honor wasn't something she could wear or speak about. It was something others measured from the outside by cloth, by custom, by quiet suffering. That night, when the bed was made and the candlelight flickered against the walls, Elira sat on the edge of the mattress, her hands trembling in her lap. The cloth rested beside her like a sleeping judge, and in that still moment, she wondered if the stars above had ever seen a girl asked to be free, and be told that freedom must bleed first. That evening, the house fell into a silence that felt different, not peaceful, but expectant, like the air before a storm. Plates were placed gently on the table, though no one had much appetite. Elira's father said grace, but his voice was faint, distracted, as if his thoughts were somewhere far from the kitchen. Her brother, usually full of questions, stared at the bread crust on his plate, tearing it slowly into smaller pieces. No one mentioned what would happen later. No one said the word test, but every glance, every avoided gaze, spoke of it. When the meal was done, Elira's mother quietly took her hand and led her to the room. There were no kisses, no blessings, just that look in her mother's eyes, a mix of fear, sorrow, and the kind of resignation passed from woman to woman. For generations, inside the room, the bed had been remade, new sheets washed with lavender. The cloth had been placed at the center, unfolded and flat. 2 candles glowed on the wooden table nearby. Elira removed her dress slowly, folding it. With care, she stepped under the covers and lay there, hands crossed over her chest, heart echoing louder than the ticking of the wall clock. Lord Taven would not arrive tonight. The ritual wasn't about him. It was about her, or more precisely, her ability to prove something that should never have needed proving. She was to lie still until morning, untouched and untouched, so that the cloth might carry the story everyone demanded to read. Ilda entered just before midnight, carrying a worn book and a thin, carved rod. She didn't speak. She simply sat by the table, opened a book, and began to write. Every few minutes, she would glance at Elira, checking the candle, adjusting the linen. The minutes stretched like thread across a loom, and in that room, where judgment hovered in the air, Elira closed her eyes and tried to remember the taste of honey, the sound of rain on rooftops, and the feeling of being a child, before silence became her language. Morning didn't arrive. All at once, it seeped into the room like a secret, soft and uncertain. The candle had burned down to a puddle of wax, and the shadows had stretched and curled into corners. Elira opened her eyes not because she wanted to, but because she had to. Ilda was already standing, holding the cloth. She examined it the way a scribe might read a scroll, eyes narrowing, lips pressed together. She said nothing, not even a sigh. Then she folded it neatly, placed it into a small wooden box lined with red velvet, and turned toward the door. "It will be delivered before noon," she said flatly, as though announcing the weather. And just like that, she left, taking the cloth, and with it, a piece of Alira no one would see again. Alira remained in bed, her body still beneath the blanket, her thoughts louder than ever. She didn't cry, not because she wasn't sad, but because sadness felt too small for what she carried now. It wasn't just the fear of failure, or the weight of what others believed purity should look like. It was the realization that her voice had no place in any of it. Her cloth would speak for her, a stranger's report would decide her fate, and the world would continue spinning as though her silence was a sign of peace, not erasure. Downstairs, her mother prepared tea and waited by the door. Lord Taven's men would arrive soon. They would not politely take the box and return with news Alira would not hear until supper. Her father busied himself sharpening tools again, as if metal might make the world feel predictable, and her brother lingered by the window, watching the road, when the cart finally appeared, pulled by black horses and carrying a man in a dark green coat. The air in the house grew colder. Alira sat up slowly, knowing this was no longer about her body or even her name. It was about a verdict sealed in linen, one that could never be questioned and never be undone. The messenger did not speak as he handed over the box. He simply placed it on the wooden table and gave a slight nod before leaving the house as quietly as he had come. The lid remained closed for a long while. No one moved. Alira's mother kept her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor. Her father stood by the door, arms crossed, jaw tense, and Alira herself, still wrapped in the soft blanket from her room, stared at the box as if it contained a storm. The silence was not just heavy, it was sacred. In their village, the moment the girl's cloth returned was a moment that rewrote her future. It could bless a marriage, or erase it. It could raise her family standing, or bury it. Finally, her mother reached forward and untied the ribbon. She lifted the lid, and for a brief second, everyone leaned in, not to see, but to feel. The cloth lay neatly folded, with a sealed note on top, pressed with Lord Taven's crest. It had already been read by his family, perhaps even discussed. Now, it came to them like a royal decree. Her mother broke the wax and opened it slowly. Her eyes scanned the words, brief, cold, factual. Then she folded it again, set it down, and let out a breath that trembled halfway through. "It's done," she whispered. Alira didn't ask what was written. She didn't need to. The message was clear. The cloth had been accepted. No challenge, no delay. The wedding would proceed. But in that moment of supposed relief, Alira felt no triumph, only the strange emptiness of passing a test she never agreed to take. Around her, the room began to move again, her father patting her shoulder, her mother already planning for the next steps, her brother asking if there would be music at the feast. But Alira stayed still. She looked out the window at the grey morning, where the sky offered no warmth, and thought not of the man she was to marry, but of the price she had quietly paid for her name to be believed. Preparations resumed with quiet urgency. The village moved as if someone had rung a distant bell that only the women could hear. Baskets of lavender and thyme were gathered. Embroidered linens were pulled from trunks. Dresses were adjusted, candles polished, and music rehearsed in the square. But while others planned celebration, Alira walked through it like a shadow. Smiles met her at every turn, polite, proud, rehearsed. "You've made your family proud," said one woman. "Lord Taven will honor you," said another. But no one asked how she felt. No one noticed the stiffness in her smile or the way her hands clenched at her sides. They saw only what they wanted. A girl who had passed the test. A girl worth marrying. Lord Taven's return was expected by dusk. He had travelled back to his estate to prepare for the union and would arrive with gifts, witnesses, and the kind of formality that turned human lives into public theatre. Alira's gown, now draped over a cedar rack, sparkled with silver thread. At the hem, her mother touched it reverently, whispering prayers. "You are ready," she said, more to herself than to her daughter. But Alira didn't feel ready. She felt distant, as though her body had become a costume she had to wear until everyone clapped that afternoon. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Alira snuck away to the old garden behind the church. The roses were dry, the grass brittle, but there, in the quiet between two crumbling statues, she found the space to breathe. She sat beneath an old oak tree and closed her eyes, not to sleep but to listen, to remember. She recalled the days before Lord Taven, before tests and linen, when her world was small but still hers. She remembered running barefoot after her brother, learning how to braid her own hair, and laughing just because the wind was silly. Now, Even the wind seemed to pause before touching her. And in that stillness, Elira whispered the name of no one. Just the word peace. Over and over, like a spell too fragile to speak out loud. Be white twilight. The road to the village lit up with torches. Lord Taven's carriage appeared slowly, pulled by 2 white horses adorned with braided marnets and golden tassels. Villagers lined the street, eager to catch a glimpse of the nobleman who had chosen one of their own. Children waved wildflowers. Mothers pressed their palms together in quiet hopes that their daughters might one day be so lucky. Elira stood at the doorway with her family, dressed in her ceremonial gown, every thread a reminder of the path already chosen for her. The fabric shimmered in the fading light, but she felt none of its glow. Her heart beat steadily, not from excitement, but from preparation, the way a bird waits before it's placed back in a cage. Lord Taven stepped down from the carriage, elegant and composed, his cloak trimmed with fur, his boots polished like mirrors. He bowed gently toward Elira and offered a smile that reached his mouth, but not his eyes. They exchanged no words. There was no need. The village had done their speaking for them. Behind him, his attendants carried gifts, bolts of silk, fine spices, a silver comb shaped like a swan. Everyone applauded. The priest appeared at the church doors with a smile carved from habit, and the bells began to ring. This was not a wedding for lovers. It was a joining of names, of lands, of expectations. And Elira, though silent, knew her role by heart. As they walked together toward the altar, side by side, and never truly close. Elira looked up at the sky. A single star had appeared above the church tower, flickering faintly. She wondered if it had always been there, even before the cloth, before the ritual, before her name was whispered with weight. Her fingers brushed against the soft veil draped over her shoulder, and in that fragile, flickering moment, with the entire village watching and her future being written in footsteps, Elira imagined what it might feel like to disappear, not as punishment or shame, but as escape, as a story never told, and therefore never controlled. The ceremony passed like a dream that refused to settle, not quite a nightmare, not quite a memory. The chapel was filled with warm light and low music. Candles flickered on every wall, casting golden halos around the faces of saints carved in stone. Elira stood at the altar, her hands folded gently over each other, her veil pulled forward like a curtain between her and the world. Lord Taven spoke his vows with practiced ease, his voice low, smooth, certain. When it was her turn, she repeated the words exactly as instructed, not from belief, but from necessity. The priest smiled kindly at them both, pronounced the union complete, and raised his hands for blessing. The room erupted in soft applause, and just like that, Elira was no longer a daughter. She was a wife. Outside, bells rang and petals were thrown into the air, fluttering like snow in the late summer breeze. Villagers clapped, some cheered, and others whispered about how radiant the bride looked, how lucky she must feel. Elira walked beside Lord Taven through the square, past the bakery, the well, the old watchtower, and into the great hall where a feast had been prepared in their honor. The table overflowed with roasted meats, glistening fruit, and bread still, warm from the oven. Music echoed through the stone walls, and laughter filled the gaps between every cup raised and every story told. But Elira's smile remained still, a delicate, painted thing that held its shape even as her thoughts wandered. Far from the room, she watched her new husband closely, not with love or curiosity, but with caution. He spoke with charm, drank without excess, and touched her shoulder only when eyes were on them. He played his part perfectly, and so did she. But beneath the table, her fingers trembled, not from nerves but from knowledge. There was something missing in him, not cruelty, not kindness, but something deeper, a space she couldn't name, and the more she noticed it, the more she wondered if it had always been there, or if it had been carved out of him, the same way silence had been carved into her daughter as night deepened, and the torches outside flickered like sleepy eyes. The guests began to leave. One by one, they bowed, kissed hands, and whispered blessings that sounded more like rehearsed phrases than heartfelt hopes. Elira stood near the entrance of the hall, her hands clasped and her posture flawless. She had learned to stand still in dresses that didn't bend and smile through evenings that never asked what she wanted. Lord Taven remained at her side, always polite, always collected, offering nods and parting words to each guest. But not once did he look at her, not truly. His eyes skimmed her face like a merchant inspecting silk, appreciating the fabric, never wondering how it was woven. When the last guest departed, the castle grew quieter, and a soft chill settled into the stone. Elira followed Lord Taven down the corridor, past tapestries that depicted noble hunts and saints with golden halos. The walls were lined with torches, but their light felt far away. Her footsteps echoed with each stride, as if the very floor was memorizing her pace. When they reached the chamber that had been prepared for them, Taven opened the door, but did not step aside. He entered first, leaving her to follow like a visitor to her own life. Inside, the room was beautifully arranged soft bed, flower petals, warm fire, every detail arranged with care. But none of it felt hers. He turned to her, offered a small smile, and said only, "You must be tired." His voice was soft, but distant, like a man commenting on the weather. Then he moved to the opposite side of the room and began removing his cloak, folding it with perfect lines. Elira stood by the hearth, watching the flames and listening to the silence between them. When she finally turned, she saw that he had settled on the cushioned bench near the window, looking out into the dark. He didn't move toward her. He didn't reach for her hand, and in that absence, Elira felt something strange, not rejection, not relief, but the beginning of a question she didn't yet know how to ask. She didn't sleep the night. Not truly. The fire crackled gently in the hearth, and the shadows on the stone walls danced in slow, quiet loops. Lord Taven remained by the window until the embers burned low, saying nothing, making no move to come closer. Eventually, he rose, crossed the room, and lay fully clothed on the bed's far side, his back to her, breathing steady, untouched by ceremony or expectation. Elira sat upright for hours, her veil now resting like a forgotten leaf across the chair. She listened to the rhythm of the room, the fire's breath, his breath, her own. It was not fear that kept her awake. It was the unfamiliar silence. Not cold, but not warm either. Like being inside a story she had agreed to tell Dot at some point near dawn. She stood and walked barefoot to the window. The sky was still dark, but the first hint of morning touched the horizon in a pale grey blur. From there, she could see the roofs of the village, the bell tower, the path that led to the forest, and beyond that, nothing but soft hills and a line of trees too distant to name. She rested her hand on the cold stone frame and whispered her own name just once, to feel it in the air. It sounded thin, smaller than she remembered, as if the day had already begun folding her into something quieter. When she turned back toward the room, she saw Taven asleep, arms crossed over his chest like a knight in an old tale carved on a tomb. She stepped lightly across the room and sat again by the fire, pulling the edge of a wool blanket over her lap. Her eyes didn't close. Instead, she traced shapes in the ashes, circles, spirals, a flower she had once drawn in the dirt as a child. That was how she stayed until the sun slipped through the shutters. Not a bride waiting for a husband, not a wife resting from joy, but a girl holding onto the last thread of something unspoken and quietly wondering if silence had always been her destiny. The days that followed were filled with rituals, but not with meaning. Elira walked the halls of the manor in dresses chosen for her, sat at tables filled with dishes she hadn't asked for, and responded to greetings with the grace expected of a wife, though she still felt like a guest. Servants bowed and called her Lady Elira, but the title slipped past her ears like water on stone. Lord Taven, too, kept to his role. He was always respectful, never cruel, but their conversations were short and hollow like pages in a book, meant only for display. He asked about her rest, her meals, the embroidery on her sleeves, but never her thoughts, never her fears, and never the wedding night, which neither of them dared to name. Each morning, he left early to walk the estate grounds or ride to the nearby village for matters of trade. Each evening, he returned with polite reports about crops, prices, or passing weather. And Elira, who once imagined that marriage might be a crossing into something more alive, now found herself standing at windows, counting birds and waiting for time to move. The manor itself felt like a carved box, beautiful, but sealed. The only real warmth came from the kitchen, where the cook hummed softly as she stirred soups, and from the stable boy who once dared to say, "It's quiet here." Too quiet for a home. But it was on the 5th day that Elira noticed something different. While walking the corridor that overlooked the garden, she saw Lord Taven standing near the fountain, speaking in low tones to a cloaked figure she didn't recognize. The conversation was brief, but when the figure handed him a folded parchment and disappeared through the servant's gate, something in his posture shifted. He stood still for a long moment, reading the note twice before tucking it into his coat. Elira watched from behind the curtain, her heart strangely alert. She didn't know why, but the garden felt colder than usual, and for the first time, she sensed that the silence in their marriage was not emptiness, it was hiding something. At night, when the manor had gone quiet and the flames in the hearth began to soften into a slow glow, Elira lay in bed pretending to sleep. Her breathing was even, her eyes gently closed, but every part of her was awake listening. Lord Taven had returned later than usual. He'd eaten little, spoken even less, and now, as she listened to the rustle of his coat being folded, the soft click of a drawer opening, she imagined him reaching for the letter. She imagined him reading it again in the low candlelight, as if searching for something inside them. Words she didn't dare ask. She didn't even move, but she could feel the weight of the room shift, as if something unspoken was pacing between them when the drawer closed, and his footsteps moved toward the window. She opened her eyes just a sliver. He stood with his back to her again, his silhouette outlined against the blue of night. He wasn't a threatening figure. In fact, he looked tired not in body, but in soul. She wondered, suddenly, if silence had been his protection, not his weapon. Perhaps whatever he carried had nothing to do with her at all. Or perhaps she had unknowingly stepped into a story still unfolding, a chapter meant for someone else. The thought gave her both fear and a strange relief. Maybe this distance wasn't rejection. Maybe it was something older, deeper, more dangerous. And then he spoke. Not to her, but to the darkness beyond the window. Just 3 words, barely above a whisper. It's almost time. Her breath caught. Time for what? She didn't move, didn't blink, just listened. He stood there a moment longer, then returned to his side of the bed, lying down without touching her. His breathing slowed. Hers did not. She stared into the glow of the fire until her eyes burned, her mind spinning threads from those 3 words. Somewhere between sleep and waking, she realized she wasn't just waiting to be a wife anymore. She was now part of something secret. And secrets in a castle never sleep quietly. The following morning, Elira walked the gardens alone, her fingers trailing along the tops of lavender bushes now heavy with early dew. The sun hadn't yet fully risen, and the sky was still painted in soft greys and pale rose. Birds chirped cautiously, as if unsure whether the day was safe to begin. She wore a simple shawl over her nightdress, uncaring if anyone saw her without the decorum of silk and laced corsets. For the first time, she didn't want to be seen as the lady of the manor. She wanted to be Elira, a girl again, walking in silence with questions that pressed against her chest like unopened letters. She paused near the fountain, the same one where she had seen Taven with the cloaked figure. She studied its surface now. The water was calm, but something floated just below, a bit of torn parchment. Her heart skipped. Kneeling down, she reached into the cold water and retrieved it. The ink had blurred, but one phrase remained clear enough to read. Not before the moon wanes. She stared at the words, trying to fit them into the puzzle she didn't know she was solving. Was it a warning? A promise? A plan? Behind her, the manor stood still, no sound of servants, no voice calling her back inside. It was as if the world was holding its breath. Later that afternoon, she tucked a dry piece of parchment into the seam of her cloak and returned to the tower library, a room few ever used. She sat beneath the stained glass window, where the colors painted her lap in soft reds and golds, and opened the old book stacked beside her. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she read anyway, pages about old traditions, coded languages, symbols of the moon, forgotten ceremonies. Hours passed. The light changed, but something inside her had awakened. Not fear, not yet. It was closer to readiness, a quiet defiance. For the first time since her wedding, she wasn't waiting for something to happen, she was listening for it. That evening, a quiet storm gathered far beyond the hills, casting distant rumbles across the horizon like a slow drumbeat. Elira sat near the hearth, her hands resting in her lap, her mind still replaying the message from the fountain. Not before the moon wanes. She had repeated it in her thoughts so many times that the words had started to lose meaning and transform into feeling like a secret rhythm stitched into the air. Lord Taven, once again, had not spoken of the note, nor the visitor, nor his. Strange words whispered to the window. He entered, dined, and retired with a formality that felt almost rehearsed. And yet, there was something different in the way his eyes paused on her, not longer, but heavier, as if he wanted to speak, but had long forgotten how. Later that night, when the candles were nearly spent, and the rain began to patter gently on the windows, Elira stepped out of bed and lit a small lantern. She wrapped herself in a dark shawl and made her way down the corridor barefoot, careful not to let the boards creak beneath her. She didn't know what she was looking for, only that something was calling. The manor, vast as it was, had many forgotten corners, rooms sealed shut, staircases that ended in walls. But there was one passage she had only heard about from. A kitchen maid, a door behind the chapel that led to the oldest part of the house, the original stone cellar. Built when the manor was still a fortress, she found a narrow door tucked behind a faded tapestry. Its wood dry and cold to the touch. It groaned faintly as it opened, and a breath of earth-scented air met her face. She descended slowly, each step echoing like a whisper through time. The lantern's glow bounced off the stone walls, revealing nothing but cobwebs and dust, until she saw it, a wooden chest, tucked beneath a stair, carved with a crescent moon. Her breath caught. She didn't yet know what it was, but something told her. This chest held more than objects. It held answers. Elira knelt before the chest, her lantern casting warm flickers across its aged surface. The crescent moon carved into the wood seemed older than the manor itself, and as she ran her fingers over the grain, she felt a strange warmth, not physical, but emotional, as if the chest had been waiting to be found. Its latch was rusted, and it took a few careful nudges before it gave way with a soft click. When she lifted the lid, a soft scent rose like dried herbs and something faintly metallic. Inside, carefully arranged, were several bundles wrapped in cloth, each tied with faded ribbon. Beneath them, a set of parchment scrolls rested, the edges browned with time, but still intact. Her hands trembled slightly as she unrolled the first scroll. The handwriting was delicate and looping a woman's hand, unmistakably. The letter began not with a greeting, but with a confession. If you found this, then you two were never meant to be seen only married, Elira's heart tightened. She read on. The letter spoke of an old custom, older than the chapel above, in which women of the estate were bound by a silent pact. They would marry not out of love, but as guardians of knowledge. Brides chosen not for beauty or wealth, but for what they carried in their bloodline, memories, rituals, and warnings. There were names listed none Elira recognized, and symbols she'd only glimpsed in the margins of ancient books. But one name appeared again and again. Lyra, always written at the end of a passage, sometimes underlined, sometimes circled. The final line chilled her. The moon will wane, and when it does, she must decide keep the silence, or break it. Elira's breath slowed. She looked back into the chest. The other scrolls, the wrapped bundles, each one, perhaps, another thread of this buried story. She suddenly realized this was never just about a marriage. It was a cycle, one that had waited generations for a woman brave enough to ask why. Elira sat beside the open chest for a long time, her thoughts unfolding like the parchment in her lap. The glow from her lantern danced softly along the stone walls, casting long, flickering shadows that almost seemed to move with intention. A quiet part of her wished she could stay in that hidden place forever, wrapped in the scent of old stories and the comfort of forgotten voices. It was the only space where she felt unseen in a way that didn't mean erased, but protected. The voices of women like Lyra, who had never been written into family records or carved into chapel stones, now spoke to her across the silence of centuries. She reread the final line of the letter. Keep the silence or break it. It echoed in her like a choice, both ancient and immediate. What did it mean to break silence in a house built upon it? Outside, thunder rolled again in the distance, soft and low, like the clearing of a giant throat. The storm was moving closer. She wrapped the letters carefully, returning them to the chest, but held on to the one that first greeted her with that chilling sentence. As she stood, the stone beneath her foot shifted slightly, uneven. She paused, knelt again, and pressed against it. It moved. Beneath the stone was a narrow hollow, just deep enough to conceal a single object, a ring. But it wasn't decorative. No gemstone, no family crest, just a plain silver band, tarnished with age, and etched inside with 3 tiny marks, a moon, a drop of water, and a key. She slipped it onto her finger instinctively, and the fit was perfect. She didn't know if it had once belonged to Lyra, or to someone who came before her, but in that moment, she felt less alone. Not watched, not judged, simply part of something greater. She closed the chest, slid the stone back into place, and walked quietly up the stairs. The letter clutched to her chest like a heartbeat. Morning came cloaked in grey. The sky held its breath, and the manor felt quieter than usual, as if the very walls knew what Elira had found. She moved through the hallways with new weight in her steps, not from fear, but from knowing. The ring on her finger was cold at first light, like it hadn't fully accepted the warmth of her skin. Yet she didn't take it off. It sat there quietly, almost pulsing with its own awareness. She had tucked the letter under the lining of her dress, near her heart, where it rustled softly with each breath. No one noticed, or perhaps no one dared to look too closely when she entered the breakfast room. Lord Taven was already seated. His hands were clasped in front of him, a cup of tea untouched, eyes fixed not on her, but on the fire behind her, or maybe on something far beyond it. "Did you sleep?" he asked. His voice was even, but the pause that followed was longer than usual. Elira nodded. She wasn't sure if she was lying. Silence settled again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It was aware, tense, shifting, as if the air itself was waiting for one of them to speak what wasn't being said after the meal. Lord Taven rose and extended a hand not to escort her, but to offer something. A small envelope, sealed with wax bearing his insignia. "You'll need this tonight," he said simply, then walked away. Elira turned the envelope in her hand. It was light, too light. She didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, she went to the garden, where the rain had left pearls on every leaf. There, among the damp silence, she sat and let the earth ground her. Birds chirped distantly, and in the soil beneath her, she imagined the roots of forgotten women, stretching silently beneath the stone walls. She whispered the name Lyra, and the wind stirred just slightly. Elira closed her eyes. She was no longer just a girl preparing for a wedding. She was a woman standing at the edge of a story she was finally ready to rewrite. As dusk approached, the envelope in Elira's hand seemed to grow heavier, not in weight, but in meaning. The wax seal had been slightly smudged by the moisture in the air, yet the mark of Lord Taven's house was still visible, sharp edges carved into a rising sun. She finally broke it open, her fingers careful, like she might disturb something sleeping inside. The parchment inside was thin, almost translucent, with a single line written in an elegant hand. You may choose to remain in silence, or to ask the question out loud. No signature, no instruction, just a choice, resting on her lap like a mirror. Elira read the words again and again, feeling their rhythm sink into her chest. What question? And if she spoke it, to whom? She thought of the ring, of the letter from Lyra, of the moon etched onto old paper, and then she thought of herself, not as a bride or a servant, but as a girl who had spent her life being told what not to ask. She folded the note, tucked it back inside the envelope, and stood. The manor's long halls echoed with her steps, the sound soft but sure. Candles had been lit, their flames swaying gently like breathing light. She passed the chapel, its door slightly ajar, and glanced inside. Empty. A hush filled the space like fog. Then, without planning to, her voice rose into the silence. Who? Was Lyra? The sound of her own words startled her, but nothing answered. No creak, no whisper, no falling candle, just silence. And then, a shift. The air felt denser, like something had awakened. The ring on her finger grew warm. She stepped back, but she didn't flee. For the first time, Elira realized that the question wasn't just about Lyra. It was about every woman before her and the silence they were asked to carry. And now, with just one voice, even if small, the silence had cracked that night. The wind slipped through the stone corridors like an old friend returning with secrets. Elira stood at the window of her room, staring out at the garden where everything had started to shift. The silver band on her finger no longer felt foreign. It had molded to her like a forgotten truth rediscovered. She could still hear the echo of her question in the chapel, not because it had been loud, but because it had been true. For the first time in her life, she had not waited for permission to speak, and something in the house had noticed. Not a ghost, not a curse, but a memory that had long been waiting to be remembered. She returned to the chest hidden beneath the floor, but not to open it, just to rest her hand on the wood. The air there was warmer now, as if the space had exhaled. I heard you, she whispered, not knowing if she meant Lyra or herself. Then she rose and moved through the sleeping manor like a shadow made of breath. No one saw her, but she wasn't hiding. Her steps were quiet, respectful not of the rules, but of the pay. She walked the halls as if she belonged to them. Now, not as property, not as future bride, but as keeper of a forgotten promise. When she reached the west corridor, the oldest part of the estate, she paused before a door she had never opened. The wood was darker, more worn than the others, with no carvings, no lock, just a keyhole shaped like a moon. Her ring slid perfectly into the gap. With a soft click, the door opened. Inside, The room was bare, except for a single chair facing a mirror, and in the mirror, though she stood alone, there were two reflections, hers, and the faintest outline of a woman with long hair and calm eyes, resting one hand on her shoulder. Elira didn't scream. She closed her eyes and breathed. Morning broke not with brilliance, but with a softness that felt like a whispered farewell. The sky outside Elira's window had turned a pale silver, and everything in the manor seemed to move slower, as if the house itself had entered a state of mourning or reverence. She woke with no rush, her hand still curled slightly from where it had rested near her heart through the night. The mirror was no longer showing two figures, only one, but the feeling hadn't left her. She still felt the weight of a hand on her shoulder, not physically, but in the place where truth settles after being buried for too long. That kind of presence never leaves. It just becomes part of you. She lit a candle not because she needed light, but because it felt like the right thing to do. In its small flicker, she reread the letter, the ring still on her finger, now warm like it had accepted its place. There were no tears in her eyes, only a clarity that washed over her, like soft rain. She wasn't afraid anymore. The ceremony would take place at dusk, as was tradition, but the girl who had once trembled at the thought of being watched, judged, and measured was no longer the same. Elira was no longer walking into a role prepared for her. She was walking into a room she had already unlocked with her own voice dot in the hallway. She passed by portraits she had once avoided looking at. Now she met their eyes, all those women with painted smiles and heavy dresses, framed in silence. She wondered how many had asked the question and how many had swallowed it. At the end of the corridor, the chapel bell began to ring, not in alarm, but as a reminder, a soft toll echoing down the stone spine of the house. Elira touched the letter one last time and whispered not a prayer, but a vow. It ends with me. And as she turned the corner, the wind lifted through the window behind her like a breath finally released. The chapel was lit with a soft golden hue, as if the sun had chosen this hour to kneel before the windows and listen. Elira entered without a veil, her hair loose around her shoulders, and the silence that greeted her was not heavy, but expectant. The priest looked up from his book, surprised by her early arrival, but said nothing. She moved past the empty pews, her dress brushing the stone like a whisper. On the altar sat the ceremonial cloth, the ancient script embroidered across it, a relic meant to bless and bind and bury. But today, it felt different. Not sacred, not cursed, just human, a piece of fabric like the lives it once touched. She knelt, not in submission, but in thought. The silence was deep, but she could hear things within it, not voices, but impressions. A cry caught in her breath, a name never spoken aloud, a farewell without a witness. And in that stillness, Elira finally understood what the ring had meant, what the hidden door had tried to show her. Chastity, in this place, had never been about virtue. It had been about control, about lineage, about power hidden in ceremony. And for generations, girls had been woven into that script, like thread praised if unseen, punished if real. But none of them had disappeared. Not really. They had left pieces behind. A letter, a ring, a door that didn't lock anymore. She rose, walked to the altar, and folded the cloth carefully. She did not rip it, nor curse it. She simply held it as one might hold the last page of a story, knowing it had to end, but grateful it was told. Then gently, she placed it in the fire basin meant for incense. It caught flame like parchment, curling inward with grace. The priest stepped forward to protest, but paused. Something in her eyes told him this was not rebellion. This was memory, finally being honored. And as the flames warmed her hands, Elira whispered not goodbye, but thank you, for the silence, for the question, and for the chance to answer. When Elira stepped outside the chapel, the sky had darkened into a soft dusk, that kind of gentle grey that doesn't threaten rain, but rather invites reflection. The garden awaited her, the same garden where the scent of lavender had once reminded her of fear. Now it smelled different, not of courage, exactly, but of peace. She walked among the overgrown hedges and paused near the statue of the unnamed maiden, the one whose eyes had always looked downward. Elira reached out and touched the stone hand, not to ask for blessing or permission, but simply to say, I see you. And for the first time, she imagined that statue not as a symbol of obedience, but of stillness that held stories too large to speak. She sat on the low stone bench beside the fountain that had stopped flowing long ago. There, she unwrapped the ring from her finger, held it one last time beneath the fading light, and placed it carefully into the water's dry basin. Not buried, not hidden, just offered someone else would find it one day. Maybe another girl in another century, asking a question no one had prepared her for. And maybe, in that moment, she would feel less alone. That would be enough. That would be more than history ever promised. The stars began to appear, faint freckles in the sky's fading skin. Elira leaned back, her breath slow, her hands warm from the fire's memory. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Perhaps there would be consequences, or questions. But tonight, for the first time, the house felt quiet in a way that didn't ache. It was no longer holding its breath, and neither was she. The story hadn't ended, it had changed hands, passed from silence to voice, from girl to woman, from secret to story. And as the fire in the chapel died down to embers, Elira closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to rest. For silence was no longer something to survive, it was something to understand, and finally, to share.